In the last section, you and I put together another require statement that required that whoever called the pickWinner function was also the person who had originally created the contract. This require statement definitely works perfectly where it is right now. However, I want to show you another little feature of the Solidity language that's going to become very useful as soon as we start writing some more complicated contracts. I want you to imagine for a second that we added in another function. So we're not going to do this. I just want you to imagine this for a moment. Imagine that we added in a function called something like return entries or something like that. And the purpose of this function right here was to loop through all the money that we had been sent inside the contract and send it back to whoever had sent it in. So maybe we would make use of this function if we wanted to cancel an entire round of the lottery and send back all of our money to whoever had sent it in. Let's kind of think through that function for just a second. Chances are we would not want to allow anyone to call that function. That's probably kind of an administrative level function, and we would probably want to make sure that only our manager was able to call it, right? Well, hey, that's no problem. We now have this require statement that we can easily copy paste down here like so. And by doing so, we are now able to say, yep, only the manager can call return entries. However, you'll notice that we now have some duplicated logic here. It's the exact same line of code duplicated in both functions. And this is a classic case of don't repeat yourself. In order to keep from not repeating ourselves, or how do we phrase that? To make sure that we don't repeat ourselves, we're going to use a feature of Solidity called function modifiers. So let's write out a function modifier, and then we'll talk about exactly what it does. I'm going to first start off by deleting this imaginary function down here, and then I'm going to replace it with a new function modifier. We're going to write out modifier. We'll then write out the name of the modifier, which in this case we'll make restricted. We'll place down a set of parentheses and then curly braces like so. Then inside of here, we'll write out that line of logic that we had just duplicated between our two functions. So it's going to be require message.sender equals manager, like so. So that's the duplicated line of code. And then immediately after that, we'll place underscore and then semicolon. Okay, one last little change, and then we'll talk about what this modifier thing does. I'm going to find my pickWinner function right here, and immediately after the public keyword, I'm going to add on restricted, like so. Okay, so let's wait a minute. One last change. We're going to delete require right here. There we go. Okay, so now let's talk about exactly what this function modifier does. When we use the modifier keyword, we are defining a new function modifier to be added to our contract. Function modifiers are used solely as a means of reducing the amount of code that you and I have to write. We just created a modifier called restricted. The name of this modifier is absolutely anything that we want it to be. I called it restricted. You could have just as easily called it something like only manager can call. So whatever you want to call it, go for it. But in this case, I decided that restricted made a little bit of sense. Inside this modifier, we place one or more lines of code. And then after that, we place an underscore and a semicolon. Now here's where things start to get interesting. This has defined a modifier called restricted. If we add this restricted name to any of our other functions inside of our contract, you can then imagine that behind the scenes, the Solidity compiler is going to take all the code out of your function, so all this code right here, and add it to the modifier in place of that underscore. So the underscore you can kind of imagine as being like a little target, like take out all the code out of that function and stick it in where that underscore is. And so our pickWinner function would eventually end up looking like this internally. So notice how we are still making that require call, and then we execute all the code for our particular function. This allows us to write one modifier and then use it in many places. So it's a classic solution to the don't repeat yourself problem. We only have to write the modifier one time. We only have to write this line of code right here one time. But now I can go back through to any line of code or any function, any function inside my contract and add on the restricted keyword. So if I add on restricted and so on, that would make sure that for any of these other functions, we are going to first run the require statement right here, and then the underscore means run all the rest of the code inside that function. Now, of course, you and I probably don't want to restrict the ability to enter the contract, so I'm going to take restricted off of here, and I'm also going to take restricted off of random as well. In this case, we really only want to restrict access to the pick winner function, so we're only going to use this modifier here. However, again, you can very easily imagine if we had other functions where we wanted to do this early validation logic, then we could use the restricted keyword that we have now created on those other functions as well. In practice, we end up using modifiers maybe once or twice, or hey, however many times is required for all of our different contracts. Anytime you start to see some repetitive logic, you can start thinking about using a modifier. Okay, so now that we have a better idea of how modifiers work, there's one last kind of big issue that I want to discuss about our contract. So let's move on to that big issue in the next video.